NATO's hardest physical test. Only British forces passed without casualties. I need you to understand the weight of that statement before we go any further. This isn't about a challenging exercise that some forces found difficult. This isn't about minor injuries or performance variations between allied nations. This is about a test so severe that every single participating nation except one suffered casualties requiring medical evacuation. We're talking about American Rangers who have survived the most brutal selection process the U.S. Army offers. We're talking about Norwegian soldiers operating in conditions their country has prepared them for since childhood. We're talking about German mountain specialists, French alpine troops, Canadian forces who train year-round in some of the harshest terrain on Earth. Every single one of these elite forces lost personnel to injury. Hypothermia or physical collapse during this exercise, every single one except the British. And before you assume this is going to be a story about superior British physical conditioning or some genetic advantage, I need to tell you right now that the reason British forces passed without casualties has nothing to do with being stronger or fitter than their allies. The Americans who collapsed were objectively more powerful by every measurable fitness metric. The Norwegians who required evacuation had more experience in the specific environment than the British could ever claim. The answer lies somewhere else entirely. In a philosophy of physical performance that contradicts almost everything modern military training emphasizes. Stay with me because what I am about to reveal will change how you think about the relationship between physical capability and operational effectiveness. The test is called Exercise Frost Endurance. It's conducted in northern Norway, above the Arctic Circle, during the darkest and coldest weeks of winter. The exercise has been running in various forms since the late 1980s. But it was redesigned in 2015 to create a standardized NATO assessment of cold weather operational capability. The parameters are deliberately extreme. Participating units must complete a 72-hour continuous operation involving movement across mountainous, Arctic terrain, establishment of multiple tactical positions, simulated combat engagements, and survival with minimal external support. The distance covered typically exceeds 80 kilometers, though the exact route varies based on weather conditions. Temperatures during the exercise regularly drop below -30°C. Wind chill can push apparent temperatures below -50. Daylight during the exercise window is limited to approximately 4 hours. The rest is Arctic darkness. Participating forces carry full operational loads: weapons, ammunition, communications equipment, survival gear, rations. Total load per soldier typically exceeds 40 kilograms. There are no vehicles. There is no helicopter support except for medical emergencies. There are no warming stations along the route. Teams must generate their own heat through movement, shelter construction, and body management. Sleep is permitted in tactical windows, but exposure management makes sustained rest nearly impossible without proper technique. The exercise is not designed to be completed by ordinary soldiers. It's designed to identify which elite forces can maintain operational capability in conditions that would incapacitate conventional units. NATO planners use the results to determine which national forces can be trusted for Arctic operations, and which require additional support or should be assigned to different theaters. The 2019 iteration of Exercise Frost Endurance became the benchmark that everyone now references. 12 nations participated with company strength elements. That's roughly 150 soldiers per nation, though exact numbers varied based on unit structure. The exercise began on a Tuesday evening in early February. It ended 72 hours later with results that shocked NATO planning staff. Let me walk you through what happened to each major participant because the pattern reveals something important. The American contingent consisted of soldiers from the 75th Ranger Regiment. These are among the most physically elite soldiers in the entire U.S. military. Ranger selection has an attrition rate exceeding 60%. Soldiers who completed are exceptional athletes by any standard. The Rangers arrived in Norway with extensive cold weather preparation. They had conducted pre-deployment training in Alaska. They were equipped with the latest American cold weather gear. Their physical conditioning was, by objective measurements, superior to most other participating forces. By hour 18, the Rangers had suffered their first serious casualty. A soldier collapsed with severe hypothermia despite showing no warning signs in the previous hour. He was evacuated by helicopter and survived, but the incident rattled the unit's confidence. By hour 36, 3 more Rangers required evacuation. 2 for cold injuries, 1 for a stress fracture that had been masked by the cold until it became catastrophic. By hour 54, the Ranger element had lost 11 soldiers to various casualties. They completed the exercise, but their effective strength had been reduced by nearly 8%. The Norwegian contingent should have had every advantage. These soldiers had grown up in Arctic conditions. Norway's military trains for winter warfare more extensively than any other NATO nation. The participating unit was from the Norwegian Army's Specialized Arctic Battalion. They knew the terrain, they knew the weather, they knew what their bodies could handle, or so they believed. The Norwegians suffered their first casualty at hour 12. A soldier who had performed perfectly during every previous Arctic exercise suddenly experienced cardiac arrhythmia that medical staff attributed to cold stress combined with exertion. He was evacuated and recovered fully, but his loss was psychologically significant. By hour 48, Norwegian casualties numbered 7. Most were cold injuries that the soldiers had concealed until they became severe. Norwegian military culture emphasizes stoic endurance. Soldiers had been trained not to report minor discomfort. That training became a liability when minor discomfort masked major medical emergencies. The German contingent was drawn from Gebirgsjäger units, the mountain infantry that Germany has maintained since before the First World War. These soldiers train extensively in alpine conditions. They are comfortable with cold, with altitude, with physical demands that would overwhelm ordinary infantry. The Germans approached exercise frost endurance with methodical precision. Their planning was exceptional. Their equipment maintenance was perfect. Their movement techniques were textbook. German casualties began at hour 22. The first was a non-commissioned officer who had served in Afghanistan and completed multiple previous winter exercises without incident. He developed frostbite on both feet that wasn't detected until tissue damage had become severe. By hour 60, German casualties totaled 9. Most were foot injuries that had developed silently inside boots that the soldiers believed were adequate for conditions. The French contingent came from the Chasseurs Alpins, France's elite mountain infantry. These soldiers train in the Alps year-round. They're comfortable with extreme cold and steep terrain. Their physical conditioning is exceptional. French casualties followed a pattern similar to the Germans. Injuries that developed without obvious symptoms until they became medical emergencies. The French lost 8 soldiers during the exercise, most in the final 24 hours when accumulated damage finally manifested. I could continue through every participating nation. The Canadians lost 6, the Dutch lost 5, the Polish lost 7, the Italians lost 12, the highest casualty rate of any participant. Every single nation that entered exercise frost endurance lost personnel to casualties, except the British. The British contingent was drawn from 45 Commando Royal Marines. 142 soldiers began the exercise. 142 soldiers completed it. 0 casualties, 0 evacuations, 0 soldiers requiring medical treatment beyond routine post-exercise assessment. When the exercise ended and the statistics were compiled, NATO staff initially assumed the British numbers contained an error. They requested verification. The verification confirmed the original report. British forces had completed NATO's hardest physical test without a single casualty. Let me tell you what this looked like from the perspective of Allied observers, because their reactions reveal how unusual this outcome was. An American liaison officer embedded with the British element reported that he kept waiting for the casualties to start. Every other unit he had observed during Arctic exercises had lost soldiers. He assumed the British would follow the same pattern. When hour after hour passed without a British soldier requiring medical attention, he began looking for explanations. Were the British hiding injuries? Were they receiving unauthorized support? Were the evaluation criteria being applied differently? None of these explanations proved valid. British soldiers weren't hiding injuries because they weren't developing injuries at the rates other forces experienced. They weren't receiving support because exercise controllers monitored all participating units equally. The evaluation criteria were identical for everyone. The British were simply performing differently in ways that produced different outcomes. If you're finding this analysis valuable and want to understand more about how military training philosophy shapes operational outcomes, hit that subscribe button right now. I'm releasing a video next week about why Norwegian and British forces have developed completely opposite approaches to Arctic survival despite training in the same environments. The divergence happened for reasons that most military historians have completely missed. But right now, let us continue because I need to explain why the British didn't suffer casualties when every other force did. The explanation begins with something called pacing philosophy, and I need you to understand this concept because it contradicts almost everything modern military culture emphasizes. Most NATO forces train soldiers to push toward their physical limits. Selection processes are designed to identify individuals who can sustain maximum effort longer than average. Training programs emphasize progressive overload, constantly increasing demands to expand physical capacity. The underlying assumption is that more capable soldiers are soldiers who can do more. British commando training takes a different approach. Royal Marines undergo one of the longest and most demanding basic training programs in the world. Yes, they must complete physical challenges that break most candidates. But the philosophy underlying this training is different from what most observers assume. British training doesn't primarily identify soldiers who can sustain maximum effort. It identifies soldiers who understand the difference between maximum effort and sustainable effort, and who can calibrate their output to mission requirements rather than to personal capacity. This distinction sounds subtle. In Arctic conditions, it becomes the difference between completing an exercise and being evacuated by helicopter. Let me show you what this looked like in practice during exercise Frost Endurance. The American Rangers moved at a pace that reflected their exceptional physical capacity. They were stronger than the British soldiers by objective measurement. Their movement speed during the first 12 hours exceeded British movement speed by approximately 15%. They were covering ground faster. They appeared to be winning. By hour 24, the American pace had degraded significantly. Soldiers who had been moving at maximum sustainable effort were now moving at survival effort. Their bodies had consumed reserves that couldn't be replaced through the limited rations and rest the exercise permitted. The soldiers who collapsed weren't the weakest members of the unit. They were often among the strongest, soldiers whose exceptional capacity had led them to expend more energy than their bodies could sustain. The British movement speed was consistent from hour 1 through hour 72. They moved at a pace that looked almost leisurely to observers accustomed to American military intensity. But that pace was calculated. It reflected deep institutional knowledge about how human bodies function in extreme cold over extended periods. A former Royal Marines instructor explained the philosophy to me in terms that clarified everything. He said that the goal isn't to move as fast as you can. The goal is to move as fast as you must. The difference determines whether you finish the mission or become a casualty that someone else has to rescue. Arctic operations require you to respect what the cold does to human physiology. You can't will your way through thermodynamics. This philosophy manifests in specific techniques that British forces employed throughout exercise Frost Endurance. The first technique is what the Royal Marines call thermal budgeting. Every soldier tracks their body heat as a resource that must be managed, rather than as a condition to be maintained. When you move faster, you generate more heat but also consume more calories and create more sweat. Sweat in Arctic conditions is extremely dangerous because moisture destroys the insulating capacity of your clothing. British soldiers actively manage their pace to minimize sweating while maintaining forward progress. During the exercise, observers noted that British soldiers would frequently slow down or stop briefly during ascents. This looked inefficient. It was actually preventing the excessive heat generation that would later cause problems. The American Rangers, by contrast, attacked ascents with intensity that their fitness easily supported. They reached the top faster, but they reached it sweating. That moisture would freeze in their clothing over the following hours, degrading their insulation exactly when they needed it most. The second technique involves layering management that goes far beyond what most NATO forces practice. British soldiers adjusted their clothing constantly during the exercise, removing layers before exertion, adding layers before rest, managing ventilation through adjustments that took only seconds but prevented moisture accumulation. This constant adjustment looked fussy to soldiers from forces that emphasized toughness over technique. But those fussy adjustments prevented the cold injuries that tougher soldiers were accumulating in their stationary clothing systems. A German observer noted that his soldiers viewed clothing adjustment as something you did during designated rest periods. British soldiers adjusted their clothing while moving, while eating, while performing tactical tasks. The adjustment was continuous rather than periodic. This continuity prevented the accumulation of moisture and heat that periodic adjustment cannot address. The third technique involves nutrition timing that reflects Arctic-specific physiological requirements. In extreme cold, the human body burns calories at dramatically elevated rates just to maintain core temperature. Physical exertion increases caloric demand further. Most NATO forces address this by issuing additional rations and instructing soldiers to eat more. British forces approach nutrition differently. It's not just about eating more. It's about eating continuously. During exercise frost endurance, British soldiers consumed small amounts of food almost hourly. They ate while moving, while conducting tactical operations, while performing every activity that permitted food consumption. This continuous intake maintained blood sugar levels and provided steady caloric fuel for thermogenesis. Other forces ate in concentrated periods, consuming large meals during designated breaks. This approach makes sense in normal conditions where digestion can proceed uninterrupted. In Arctic conditions, large meals divert blood to the digestive system, reducing circulation to extremities and increasing cold injury risk. The British approach maintains steady nutrition without the circulatory compromises that large meals create. Let me tell you about a specific incident that illustrates these differences, because concrete examples reveal truth better than abstractions. At approximately hour 30 of the exercise, British and American elements happened to establish rest positions within visual range of each other. An American liaison officer observed both groups during this period and later provided detailed notes. The American Rangers established their position efficiently. They set up shelter, posted security, and began heating rations for a meal. Most soldiers rested during this period, conserving energy for the next movement phase. Their approach reflected sound military logic. Rest when you can, eat when you can, move when you must. The British soldiers established their position, but then immediately began what the liaison officer described as constant activity. Soldiers cycled between rest, movement within the position, equipment adjustment, and food consumption. Nobody stayed stationary for more than a few minutes. The position appeared chaotic compared to the disciplined American rest. What the liaison officer was observing was deliberate circulation maintenance. In extreme cold, stationary rest allows body temperature to drop rapidly. The energy savings from rest are offset by the energy required to re-warm after rest. British soldiers maintain low-level activity during rest periods specifically to prevent the temperature drops that stationary rest permits. When both elements prepared to move, the contrast was revealing. The American soldiers who had rested effectively now needed several minutes of vigorous movement to restore circulation to cold extremities. Their feet had cooled during rest. Their hands had stiffened. They were starting the next movement phase from a thermal deficit. The British soldiers transitioned to movement without this warming period. Their continuous activity during rest had maintained circulation. They moved immediately at their standard pace while the Americans were still working through the stiffness that rest had created. This pattern repeated throughout the exercise. American physical superiority translated to faster movement during peak effort periods. British thermal management translated to more consistent performance across all periods. Over 72 hours, consistency proved more valuable than peaks. Now I need to explain why other forces have unadopted British techniques, because this question reveals something important about military organizational culture. The British approach to Arctic operations isn't secret. Allied forces have observed Royal Marines training for decades. Exchange programs have placed NATO personnel alongside British units in Arctic environments. The techniques I've described are documented and available, yet most NATO forces continue employing approaches that produce higher casualty rates. Why? The answer involves institutional identity and what military organizations value. American military culture values intensity. The soldier who attacks challenges with maximum effort embodies American military ideals. Selection processes identify individuals who sustain high effort. Training programs reward high effort. The entire institutional structure reinforces an approach that works brilliantly in many contexts, but creates vulnerabilities in others. Telling American soldiers to slow down, to pace themselves, to prioritize sustainability over intensity contradicts institutional identity. It feels like accepting limitation rather than transcending it. The soldiers who have proven themselves through intensity resist being told that intensity is wrong. Norwegian military culture values stoic endurance. Complaining about discomfort is viewed as weakness. Soldiers are trained to suffer silently and continue performing. This works well for building mental toughness. It works poorly for identifying medical emergencies before they become casualties. The Norwegian soldiers who concealed developing injuries weren't lacking toughness. They had too much of it, deployed inappropriately. German military culture values systematic adherence to procedure. German soldiers followed their cold weather protocols precisely. The problem was that protocols developed for previous exercises did not account for the specific conditions of frost endurance. British soldiers adapted continuously to actual conditions. German soldiers executed procedures designed for expected conditions. When conditions deviated from expectations, German procedures failed while British adaptations succeeded. Each NATO force brought the strengths of their institutional culture into exercise frost endurance. Those strengths became liabilities in an environment that punished their underlying assumptions. The British approach works in the Arctic not because British soldiers are better, but because British institutional culture happens. To align with what Arctic conditions require, pacing over intensity, constant adaptation over procedural adherence, physical awareness over stoic concealment. These cultural characteristics were developed through decades of Arctic training and refined through institutional learning that prioritized results over ideology. Let me tell you what happened after exercise frost endurance because the aftermath reveals how. Professional militaries respond to uncomfortable data. NATO issued a lessons learned document that analyzed casualty patterns across participating forces. The document identified thermal management, pacing, and nutrition timing as key factors differentiating British performance. It recommended that Allied forces study British techniques and consider incorporating them into training. Several nations implemented changes. The American military modified cold weather training to include more emphasis on pace management. Norwegian forces implemented new protocols for injury reporting that reduced the stigma of acknowledging physical problems. German forces added adaptability training that encouraged deviation from procedures when conditions required it. The results of subsequent exercises showed improvement. Casualty rates dropped across most participating nations. The gap between British performance and Allied performance narrowed. But the gap persists. As of the most recent frost endurance iteration, British forces continue outperforming Allies in casualty avoidance, though the differences become less dramatic. The persistence of this gap reveals something about how deeply institutional culture embeds itself. Changes in training can modify behavior, but they cannot easily transform underlying values that have developed over decades. American soldiers who have intellectually accepted pace management still struggle to implement it when their instincts tell them to push harder. Norwegian soldiers who have learned to report injuries still hesitate because their culture makes reporting feel like weakness. Full convergence with British approaches would require not just training changes, but cultural transformation. Most NATO forces have understandably concluded that such transformation isn't worth the institutional cost. They've accepted some performance gap in Arctic operations rather than restructuring their entire military culture around Arctic requirements. This is a rational choice. Arctic operations represent one scenario among many that military forces must prepare for. Optimizing entirely for Arctic performance would degrade performance in other environments. The British have chosen to maintain strong Arctic capability because their strategic requirements demand it. Other nations have chosen different priorities based on different strategic requirements. But the existence of this gap matters for NATO planning. When coalition operations in Arctic environments are contemplated, planners now know that casualty rates will vary significantly between national contingents. This knowledge shapes how missions are assigned and how support is allocated. Let me bring this to something larger because exercise frost endurance reveals truths that extend beyond military operations. The relationship between capability and sustainability appears in every domain where humans perform. Under challenging conditions, athletes who train at maximum intensity frequently suffer injuries that sidelined. Athletes with more conservative approaches avoid. Businesses that pursue maximum growth frequently collapse, while businesses that prioritize sustainability persist. Individuals who work at maximum capacity frequently burn out, while individuals who pace themselves maintain performance over careers. The British Commando approach to Arctic operations embodies wisdom about human performance that applies broadly. Capability matters, but sustainable capability matters more. The ability to perform at high levels for short periods is less valuable than the ability to perform at moderate levels indefinitely. The peak matters less than the duration. This wisdom contradicts modern cultural emphasis on maximum performance, peak achievement, and pushing limits. We celebrate athletes who break records, entrepreneurs who build billion-dollar companies, professionals who work 100-hour weeks. We celebrate the peak without acknowledging the unsustainability that peaks frequently require. Exercise frost endurance is a reminder that sustainability has value. The forces that finished with 0 casualties didn't finish first. They didn't set records. They didn't demonstrate exceptional physical capability by any conventional measure. They just finished. All of them. While forces that were faster, stronger, and more intense saw their members evacuated by helicopter. What do you think about this analysis? Does the idea that pacing and thermal management matter more than physical fitness in extreme conditions challenge your assumptions about military performance? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'm particularly interested in hearing from anyone who has participated in Arctic exercises and can speak to how different national forces approach these challenges. If you found this valuable, hit that like button and subscribe. I release detailed analyses like this every week, always focused on understanding the deeper dynamics that determine outcomes rather than surface-level capability comparisons. The next video drops in 3 days. I'm examining why British and American Special Operations Forces have developed completely opposite approaches to physical training despite decades of close partnership. The divergence reveals something important about how organizational values shape capability development in ways that neither side fully recognizes. Till next time, remember that the relationship between capability and performance is more complex than we usually acknowledge. More isn't always better. Faster isn't always superior. The forces that excel in the most demanding conditions are often those that have learned to respect limits rather than constantly testing them. That's the lesson from Exercise Frost Endurance. That's the lesson that British commandos have embedded in their institutional culture. And that's why they keep completing challenges that break forces who are stronger, fitter, and more intense by every conventional measure. The hardest physical test in NATO wasn't won by the most physical force. Was won by the force that understood what the test actually required and calibrated their approach accordingly. Understanding what challenges actually require, rather than assuming they require maximum effort, is wisdom that applies far beyond military operations. That's what British forces demonstrated in the Arctic. That's what other forces are still learning to understand. And that's why this exercise continues to shape how NATO thinks about extreme environment operations. The casualties that other forces suffered weren't signs of weakness. They were signs of strength deployed inappropriately. The soldiers who collapsed were often the most capable, pushing hardest, demonstrating the intensity that their cultures valued. Their cultures failed them by valuing intensity over sustainability in a context where sustainability was what mattered. British culture failed nobody during Exercise Frost Endurance, because British culture had learned, through decades of Arctic experience, what that specific context required. That learning is institutional knowledge of the most valuable kind. It can be studied by outsiders, but not easily replicated because it requires not just technique, but values that support the technique. The next time you watch elite forces operating in challenging environments, look for this dynamic. The forces that appear most impressive in the moment may not be the forces that perform best over time. Sustainability is less visually dramatic than intensity, but it produces results that intensity cannot match when conditions extend beyond what intensity can sustain. That's the deepest lesson from NATO's hardest physical test. That's why only British forces passed without casualties. And that's why this distinction matters for understanding what military excellence actually means when the stakes are real and the environment is unforgiving.